Welcome back to another episode of Be Our Guest here on Musical Theater Radio. I am your host, as always, Jean-Paul Yovanov. In musical theater, there are legendary writing teams, Kander and Ebb, Lerner and Lowe, Comden and Green, and yes, I know they both wrote lyrics and book, but legends nonetheless. But few have had the cultural impact, not only in the musical theater world, but beyond the walls of the theater, like Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. Even people who know nothing about musical theater probably have heard of at least a few of their works, Oklahoma or, of course, Sound of Music. Today, we're going to delve into one of their other incredible shows, Carousel. So I'd like to welcome to the show Barry Kester, the author of the book Round in Circles, the story of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Carousel. Welcome, Barry. Hello.
Hello, nice to meet you, Jean-Paul, and thank you very much for inviting me onto the show.
No problem, no problem. Now, before we delve into the book and we talk more about that, I want to get to know you a little bit better, so our listeners know who you are as well. So, in 30 seconds, we're going to get a bio. So, what is the 30-second bio of Barry?
A 30-second bio of Barry. Well, Barry was born in 1944. A year after Oklahoma and a year before Carousel. So that explains my love of Rodgers and Hammerstein and the golden age of Broadway musicals in general. I grew up with it. It was the soundtrack to my childhood, all these wonderful shows. And I'm speaking to you not as a professional author, not as a theater historian or a musicologist, simply as a fan who had a crazy idea one day and took his fandom a little bit too far and decided to write a book about his favorite show. My background, I was a chartered accountant. I had my own practice. And when I stopped working around 2010, I had this crazy idea. And our conversation today is the result of that crazy idea.
Nice. So you said when you were growing up that you were already into musical theater and that sort of thing. Are you kind of the black sheep of the family, or is that across the family who are into theater?
No, I think my parents' generation, my father was in the film business, so on the distribution side. So we were, if you like, on the periphery of the entertainment industry, perhaps more aware of things than other households. And my parents were big theatre goers. In fact, they said, and I'm sure the story is apocryphal, that they took me to the initial run of Oklahoma, Drury Lane in the mid 1940s. I'd have been 3 or 4. So, I mean, people don't do it today. So I'm sure they didn't take me, but I was literally thrown into it, and certainly not the black sheep.
Okay, nice. So let's jump ahead. So let's jump ahead to 2010. You've retired. You're no longer the accountant. What was the inspiration to write this book? What was that aha moment?
Well, like many people, I'd long had a dream of perhaps trying my hand at writing it. I love reading, and I've always enjoyed writing. Even my professional letters, I took a great deal of pride in. I always felt it was, if you're going to have an argument with His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, as it now is, better to entertain them with a well-written letter than bore them to tears with pages and pages of drivel. So that was the key motivation. But I thought if I ever were to do so, it would be a novel. But over the years, I'd built up a massive library of books about musical theatre, biographies of Rodgers, Hammerstein, Kern, Gershwin, and the like, stories about individual musicals, and there was nothing about Carousel. And I did some more research to make sure that there wasn't one out there and that I hadn't missed it. There wasn't. And so I thought, all right, let's ease our way into this writing lark and try something which I thought would be a little simpler. How wrong could I have been? It was crazy. I had a good knowledge of the background to the show, but not enough to write a whole book. And I had no idea whether I would get any cooperation from Rodgers, the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization. Would they encourage me? Would they discourage me? Would they give me access to their records? Would I get access to the Rodgers and Hammerstein's papers in the various libraries across the United States? I had no idea. I mean, as it turned out, hello. Oh,
just like live theater. Maybe that's Rodgers and Hammerstein Foundation calling you, and
maybe. I was on the point of saying, as it turned out, they were incredibly cooperative all the way. So, that's how it started, and that was back in 2010. In the meantime, life got in the way a great deal. I lost my wife in 2013. Then I had the good fortune to meet my present partner. We bought a house together. We knocked it down and rebuilt it. So it wasn't really until about 2016, 2017 that I got down to the nitty-gritty.
Wow. It's, just like writing a musical, it takes time. And sometimes there's starts and stops to it. And like you said, life gets in the way of things. But that germ, that inspiration was always there. So congratulations on just following through. That's some of the times the hardest thing. So the fact that you wrote it is fantastic. So explain to the listener, some of them might not know the plot of Carousel. So you could tell us the plot and then maybe the background and how it got to be part of the musical theater canon of works.
I think it was always destined to be part of musical theater canon. Carousel is based on a play by Ferenc Molnar, Hungarian playwright, and it had its premiere in 1909, a play called Lilium, and it was not well received initially. It wasn't well received until after the First World War, when it was substantially rewritten with the help of a German playwright, friend of Molnar's. And then that revised play became a huge hit across Europe and in 1921 in New York. And the reason I say it was always destined to be a part of musical theater is because one of the people who admired the play was Giacomo Puccini, who begged Molnar to grant him the rights to turn it into an opera. Molnar turned to Puccini and said, "No way is that happening, my friend. I want Lilium to be remembered as a great Molnar play, not as the libretto of a Puccini opera." And yet 20 years later, he gave Rodgers and Hammerstein the rights. So Lilium tells the story of a carousel barker, the Lilium of the title, who falls in love with a young, in Lilium, she's a housekeeper called Julie, and they get together. Lilium has a somewhat violent disposition. He hits Julie, when Julie becomes pregnant, Lilium gets desperate for some money and it takes part in an ill-fated robbery. Rather than get caught, he kills himself. And then you get the scenes in heaven, which people who know Carousel will take follows. In Lilium, there's no redemption for Lilium. He ends up burning forever in hell. So it's an unlikely subject for a musical, certainly an American musical. It might be likely for a Puccini opera, but it's certainly not likely for an American musical. And so when the Theatre Guild, who produced Lilium on Broadway, approached Rodgers and Hammerstein after their success with Oklahoma, their initial reaction was absolutely not, absolutely not. And yet there was something about the play which attracted them, and they couldn't let it go. And eventually their no became a yes. And I do explain that process in the book.
Nice. So
I also explain it in the book how the English translation, although it is credited to a chap by the name of Benjamin Glaser, there is, in my opinion, a 70–80% likelihood that that English translation was by Lawrence Hart, Richard Rodgers' former partner, rather than Glaser, who actually gets the credit. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction.
Very interesting. So just take it back. What was the difference between Rodgers and Hammerstein getting the rights to do it and Puccini not? Obviously, there was a time difference. What happened that one got accepted and the other one didn't?
Well, after Puccini was turned down by Molnar, Franz Lehar approached Molnar, Gershwin approached Molnar, and there was a very serious attempt by Kurt Weill, as well, to persuade them to persuade Molnar to let him have the rights. Molnar kept saying no, no, no. What turned him around was that in October 1943, in one final desperate effort, the directors of the Theatre Guild, Theresa Helburn and Lawrence Langner, persuaded Molnar to go, and he was living in New York by that time at the Plaza Hotel, persuaded him to go and see a performance of Oklahoma. Molnar knew Green Grow the Lilacs, the play on which Oklahoma was based, and he was so captured by Oklahoma that he changed his mind.
Wow.
I suspect that the queues around the block to get tickets for Oklahoma might have had an influence as well, because although he ended up with quite a small percentage, it was a very nice pension fund to have. It's never been admitted, but one can draw one's own conclusions. But it was literally the day after seeing Oklahoma, he said, all right. And at that point, the Theatre Guild hadn't even approached Rodgers and Hammerstein about doing the shows. So they thought they were onto another absolute winner. And they met, as they were doing every week, for lunch at Sardi's. And they put the proposal to Rodgers and Hammerstein. And as one, they turned around and said, no, are you mad?
That's crazy. That's crazy. But I'm glad they did turn around and decide to do it.
Oh my.
So the book is not just about Carousel, because I understand you talk about the relationships between Rodgers and Hammerstein. Love to hear a little bit about that and how they work together and that sort of thing.
Rodgers had been with Larry Hart for over 20 years. Hammerstein worked a lot with Jerome Kern, but he never had that sort of exclusive relationship that Rodgers and Hart had. By 1942, Larry Hart was a non-functioning alcoholic, and Rodgers had approached Hammerstein a year earlier with a view to them working together. He knew that his days with Hart were numbered. They had a tremendous respect for each other. and their partnership for the rest of Hammerstein's life was based on that mutual respect. They were very, very different men. Hammerstein, very much a country guy, not an urban city party goer. Richard Rodgers was much more the city type. So they had not a great deal in common. In fact, I think throughout the relationship, they only went on holiday together once, the two families. But they had a tremendous working respect for each other. They decided at the very start, there were two fundamental rules they agreed on from the very start. One, that Hammerstein would write the lyrics first, which was unheard of on Broadway. Rodgers, every song he wrote with Larry Hart, music came first.
Yeah.
But they wanted to write a new type of musical. And this was also something, a fundamental part of their relationship. They wanted to get away from the silly, trivial plots of the 1920s and 30s musicals. They wanted to tackle more serious matter. They wanted to write for character. And to do that, they felt it far preferable to have the lyrics arising naturally out of the book. And so Rodgers agreed to that, to change his working style completely. The other key issue that they agreed upon was that if either of them did not like something the other had written, there would be no debate. It would go.
Huh.
They had their awkward moments. Richard Rodgers, and I had the pleasure of meeting Rodgers once in my youth. Rodgers undoubtedly was a difficult character. And one of the joys I had in my research in the New York Public Library, looking through his correspondence, was to try and find out if Rodgers was as black as he has often been painted, even by his family. So he was, as I say, an awkward character. He gave praise very lightly. And at one point during the writing of The King and I, their relationship got very thoroughly tested. Hammerstein, this is a bit of a diversion from Carousel, but Hammerstein had labored for weeks on the lyric of Hello, Young Lovers. And when it was finally finished, he thought it was one of the best lyrics he'd ever written. And he sent it off, no email in those days, just stuck it in the post and sent it off to Rodgers and waited for a phone call to say, yes, I like it. And days went by and he hadn't heard anything. And in the end, he phoned Rodgers, asked him if he'd received the lyric. And Rodgers said yes. And Hammerstein said, and it'll do. And that was it. And as I say, that was almost a breaking point. And after King and I, Rodgers took a break. He wrote the music for Victory at Sea, a television documentary series. And they did take a little break from one another, but they knew they needed each other. And they got back together.
Wow. I knew about the writing process of, with Rodgers and Hart, how they wrote, and then Rodgers and Hammerstein, but I did not know about these rules that you mentioned, which the first one, I kind of had an idea of writing the lyrics first, but yeah, I didn't know about we could veto each other if we didn't like it.
It's I'm sure it wasn't as harsh as that. Rodgers actually used, in a television interview I saw, he said something along the lines, we'll try it your way. If that doesn't work, we'll try it my way.
Well, you know what? It seemed to work because we got some incredible songs and shows.
It absolutely did. I mean, their relationship was like a marriage, in fact, and probably in some ways it was tougher than a marriage, because everything they did was in the glare of the spotlight.
Yeah. Wow.
Even in those days.
So you mentioned in the book other productions of of Carousel through time, and you mentioned that the National Theatre's 1992 production has been said it's the finest production to date. What made it stand out amongst all the other ones, including the original?
Well, first of all, Nicholas Heitner is a brilliant director. He stripped it down. He went back to Molnar's original play and allowing for the fact that the setting was moved from Budapest to Maine. He wanted to get the grittiness back. The common word about that 1992 production was how dark it was. The characters weren't dressed in bright, colorful Broadway costumes. They were made to look dirty. You could almost smell them. You know, these were people at the very bottom end of society. And Heitner brought that out. He went against type, and he probably wouldn't have been able to do so had Rodgers and Hammerstein been alive in 1992. They always cast singer actors. The singing voice was much more important. Heitner employed actor singers. So the Billy, for example, listen to the LP. I don't want to do him. That's showing my age saying LP. Listen to that.
I have tons of LPs, no worries.
The download or whatever. Listen to that production, and he's the only one who came and did it in New York as well. He hasn't got a great singing voice, but he acts the part of Billy so well. And the same applies to the actress who played Julie, not a pure soprano like Jan Clayton, who originated the role. Their acting ability to really get into these Molnar characters, and remember, the characters not created by Rodgers and Hammerstein, but created by one of the 20th century's great European playwrights. They got those characters, and that's what made it so special.
Did you get to see it?
I saw it 4 times. Yes. Yeah.
Well, let me ask that you saw it 4 times. Did you notice something different every time?
It was the first professional production I had ever seen. It hadn't been on in London prior to the original 1951 production.
But I mean, every time you went to go see it for that one production, did you notice different things that you didn't notice the last time you went to see it? Was it that in depth and layered?
I really can't remember. I was a lot younger then.
I hear you.
I'm much more critical now. I saw the 2018 Broadway revival that Jack O'Brien staged on Broadway, and I was so bitterly disappointed with that. I had been warned by someone who had seen it that I wouldn't enjoy it.
Yeah.
And that person wasn't wrong. It was very disappointing. But against that, this last summer, there was a production in a small hotel theatre in the middle of England that I traveled up to see. Fabulous cast, an orchestra of 12, but they did it absolutely beautifully. And I've seen a production in an off West End theatre in about 2014, 2015. An orchestra of 5, but again, it was done so sympathetically, with such great sensitivity by the cast that it was it was a beautiful production. And I think that's one of the reasons why this show and others like it will survive, because there is a solid foundation there. And if you have a director who's canny enough to let the play speak, add his own interpretation, but respect what the creators came up with, respect the creator's vision, these great works will survive. They don't need, it's lovely to hear Carousel with an orchestra of 40 or 50, but it works. It can work with an orchestra of 5.
And I was about to say that because the original play, right? It's a gritty, right? And it's that sort of thing. And when you make it big and luscious, it loses something. So I totally understand where you're coming from with that. And yeah, orchestra of 4 and a simple theater can be just as powerful, if not more, than a big 2,000 Broadway house. So quick question: how many times do you think you've seen Carousel? I know not.
Well, one of the consequences of the big 5 Rodgers and Hammerstein shows, Oklahoma, Carousel, South Pacific, King and I, and Sound of Music, Carousel by 1992 had become a little bit neglected. It's not an easy watch. The subject matter alone makes it not an easy watch, in spite of its fabulous score. So it had fallen a little bit out of favor, wasn't being revived as much as the others. As I say, it hadn't been in London since 1951. What Nicholas Hytner's production did was to strip it back and remind everybody what a fantastic piece of theatre it is. And since then, it's hardly been off the stage. It's been all over the States. There's been many great productions in the States, and there's been a lot of productions here in London. So since that production, 1992, I've probably seen half a dozen times.
That's impressive. Because like you said, if it's, you got to find a company that wants to do the show, but you know, the fact that you've been able to see it all those times, that's great.
One of the things that's happening to Carousel is that it is being performed by opera companies. I saw a wonderful production here in 2012 by Opera North, which is our #1 provincial opera company in the UK, and it was done by the English National Opera at the Coliseum 3 years ago. It's been done by several opera companies in the States, and maybe that's again where its future lies.
Puccini's somewhere going, I knew that. I knew it would work. So.
Well, when I started doing the book, Puccini's name kept coming up, and I have long said, and I said this to Ted Chapin at the Rodgers and Hammerstein organization in one of our conversations, that to me, Rodgers is the Puccini of Broadway. There's a richness to his music, his harmonies, that are very Puccini-esque. And the bench scene, the first scene in Carousel, is an absolute direct descendant, if you will, of Act 1 in La Boheme, where Rodolfo and Mimi meet and fall in love. Wow. There's a tremendous similarity there.
So I have to ask this one. I was looking at your stuff, and You'll Never Walk Alone is associated with a football club at Liverpool, I believe. I've never heard of this because I'm over here in North America, so I didn't know about this. How does a song from an American Broadway musical from the 40s end up as a British football club's song?
Well, I've written a chapter on that very subject, yeah. So I think if people want to know, they're going to have to read. Okay, short answer.
Yeah, just a little taster, so we want to read more.
Short answer. In 1963, the height of the Beatles, pop artists like Paul McCartney were looking ahead to the days when their pop career would be over, and would they continue to be able to have a career in show business. So the Beatles recorded the song Till There Was You from Music Man, and it did very, very well. So Jerry and the Pacemakers, who had 2 #1 hits with pop songs, decided to follow suit. And Jerry Marsden, the leader of the group, loved Carousel. He'd seen the film a number of times, and he suggested You'll Never Walk Alone. Jerry and the Pacemakers are a Liverpool group, like the Beatles were also a Liverpool group. And what used to happen in those days, before the match started, a football match started, over the sound system, they would play the #1 songs of the day. They started playing You'll Never Walk Alone just before kickoff at Anfield, Liverpool Stadium. And it took. And the crowd started singing along. And whereas normally, as the record disappeared down and out of the pop charts and would not be heard again, the crowd wouldn't let You'll Never Walk Alone go. So it became adopted. And it's now the inscription on the Liverpool shirt crest. It's the words You'll Never Walk Alone are on the gates to the stadium. It is absolutely part of Liverpool's culture. And as I am not a Liverpool supporter, it's a real kick in the teeth to me. I'd much rather it were my team's song.
I'm curious how many attendees at the football games know that this is from a musical from the 40s, or they just kind of sing along with it now because they know. I'm curious.
I suspect a lot of them do know. Okay. They cannot not know after all these years.
Oh man. Okay. As a side note, what's your club that you follow?
My club, Tottenham Hotspur.
Okay. They're doing well from what I saw. Aren't they like in second or something?
Yeah, but very, very patchy.
Okay. We'll just leave it at that then.
They have as many flops as hits.
Okay. As a really side note, what Rodgers and Hammerstein song would you think should be Tottenham clubs? What would you like if you could choose?
You know what? I have never, ever, never considered that question.
Nobody probably has, to be honest. But.
For some reason, Bloody Mary is coming to mind.
I would take it. That'd be awesome to hear them singing that. Barry, how do people find your book? The where, the what, the how, and all that sort of thing.
Well, my publisher is a small independent publisher in Manchester, so they haven't got the resources of one of the major publishing houses, but it's on Amazon, and it is being distributed by Gardeners, who supply all major bookstores. So it should be available in whatever your equivalent of Barnes and Noble is, or maybe you have Barnes and Noble in Canada. I don't know.
I don't even remember. Maybe. I don't even know. Barry, congratulations on writing the book and sticking with it from that, that idea at the beginning to getting it done. It takes a lot of heart and will and desire to do it. So whatever happens, I have to congratulate you on that. So
thank you very much.
No problem. And thank you for coming on today. We'll post in our social media how people can get the book and put some links in there for you.
And thank you for being such a kind and generous interviewer.
No problem. No problem. All right. We were just speaking with Barry Kester, the author of the book Round in Circles, the story of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Carousel. Tune in next week as we'll speak with another guest or guests about the life, love, and passion that is musical theater. I'm your host, as always, Jean-Paul Jovanov, and until next time, I'll see you when I see you.